The morning my daughter-in-law showed up with a man in a charcoal suit, I was on my knees in the backyard, pulling up spent tulip bulbs. It was the first Tuesday of June, 11 days to my son's wedding. She stood at the edge of the patio, in heels that were completely wrong for the slate path, smiling the way people smile when they've already decided something before they've spoken a word. The man beside her was holding a leather briefcase and looking at my house the way people look at things they're calculating. "Mom, Kathleen," she said. "This is Randall. He's a financial planner. We thought it would be a good time to talk about your future." My hands were still dirty from the garden. I said I'd put on some coffee. I already knew what they wanted. What I hadn't told anyone, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even my oldest friend Louise, was that I'd found something 3 weeks earlier that had changed everything. My late husband Edmund had left me something none of them knew existed, and it had given me the only thing I truly needed in that moment. Time to watch and wait and understand exactly who I was dealing with. But to make sense of that Tuesday morning, you'd have to go back to February, when my son called to tell me he was getting married. I was making split pea soup, Edmund's recipe, the one I'd been making every February since 1988, because February in upstate New York demands something warm and patient, the kind of cooking that takes all day. The phone rang, and Michael's voice had that lift to it I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I have something to tell you." My stomach tightened the way it does when you're a mother, and your child sounds exactly like he did at 16, when something had either gone wonderfully right or terribly wrong. "Tell me." "I'm getting married. Her name is Portia." I set down the spoon. "How long have you been seeing her?" A pause. 7 months. 7 months, and this was the first I was hearing her name. I pushed that aside and asked the right questions. "What does she do? Where did you meet? When can I meet her?" I can still see the quality of the light through my kitchen window that afternoon. Gray and flat, February light that makes everything look like a photograph of something long ago. But I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't felt since Edmund died 18 months before. Hope, the uncomplicated kind. Michael said she worked in real estate development. Smart, driven, knew exactly what she wanted. He said it like that was a simple compliment. He asked if they could come to dinner the following Sunday. I spent 3 days preparing. I made Edmund's pot roast, the one that took all day and filled the house with something that smelled like every good Sunday we'd ever had. I made my grandmother's dinner rolls from scratch, which I hadn't done in years because they were too much trouble for one person. I borrowed Louise's good linen tablecloth and ironed it the night before. My daughter-in-law arrived on Sunday with her mother, which Michael had not mentioned. Cordelia was somewhere in her early 60s, a tailored blazer. The kind of handshake that communicates she spent considerable time being impressed by herself. She looked around my dining room the way real estate agents look at properties they're about to undervalue. "What a cozy space," she said, not a compliment. My daughter-in-law was beautiful in the way that requires significant resources to maintain. She touched my shoulder when I offered a hug, both hands, the way you'd steady a piece of furniture. "Mrs. Bassett," she said, "not Mom, not my first name, Mrs. Bassett." We sat down to dinner. The questions began before the salad course was over. Cordelia did most of it, casual-seeming things woven between comments about the neighborhood and property values. Did Edmund have a pension? Was the house paid off? Had I thought about what I'd do long-term? I gave short answers. Michael talked too fast, filling silences, smoothing things over. My daughter-in-law ate very little and checked her phone under the table. When I brought out the pot roast, Cordelia leaned forward with a warm smile that stopped at her eyes. "So, Kathleen, when Edmund passed, were there any surprises?" Estate planning can be complicated, especially when there are assets that weren't fully discussed. My daughter-in-law said, "Mother," in a way that meant keep going. I said everything had been handled properly. After they left, my daughter-in-law having praised the dinner in the particular tone people use when they mean the opposite, I sat at the kitchen table with the leftover rolls and called Louise. "Something's off," I told her. "Give her time," Louise said. "You're meeting for the first time." She was probably nervous. My daughter-in-law hadn't seemed nervous at all. The next 4 months taught me the difference between being excluded and being erased. I was not invited to help plan the wedding. When I offered, Michael said they had things figured out. When I offered to make my mother's apple cake, I'd made it for every family celebration since before Michael was born. My daughter-in-law laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. "Oh, that's so sweet. But we've already booked someone. We can't risk anything going sideways." Going sideways, as though love baked into a recipe, was a variable that couldn't be trusted. I found a dress for the wedding, deep green wool crepe, that Edmund always said brought out my eyes. I had my hair done at the salon I'd been going to for 12 years. I drove myself to the venue, a converted estate outside of town, and was directed to my seat by a young woman with a clipboard. Row 6. I stood there for a moment. I was the groom's mother. I'd carried this man, raised him alone for 11 years after his father and I divorced, before Edmund. I'd been there for every broken bone and broken heart. Row 6. Cordelia sat in the second row. I could see the back of her head from where I was placed, positioned between the wedding party and a row of people from my daughter-in-law's side I'd never met. The ceremony was beautiful, I suppose. I spent most of it craning to see Michael's face clearly enough to read his expression. At the reception, I was seated at table 11 with a distant cousin of my daughter-in-law's who spent most of dinner describing her timeshare situation in Myrtle Beach. When the toasts came, my daughter-in-law's father spoke. Then her mother, then her maid of honor, then her brother, then a college roommate. Someone finally said something about the groom's side, and my daughter-in-law looked up as though she'd momentarily misplaced me. Of course, Mom Kathleen can say a few words if she'd like. I stood. I thanked God for the beautiful day. I said watching Michael become the man he was had been my greatest joy. I said I wished Edmund were here. I was about halfway through when my daughter-in-law began clapping, decisive, rhythmic, pointed, and the room joined in. My words dissolved into the noise. I sat back down. I ate the rubbery chicken. I watched my son dance with my daughter-in-law, then with Cordelia, then with my daughter-in-law's sisters. At 10:15, I found Michael near the bar and told him I was heading out. He hugged me quickly, his attention already drifting back over my shoulder. "Thanks for everything, Mom. Love you." He was looking somewhere else when he said it. In the parking lot, between 2 rows of cars, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice. She was with her bridesmaids, somewhere in the dark. "She'll try to make herself part of everything," my daughter-in-law was saying. "But she's manageable. She doesn't have real money, so there's no leverage either way." Laughter, someone said, the harmless type. "Exactly," she said. I sat in my car for 15 minutes before I could drive. 6 weeks after the wedding, Michael had not called once without me calling first. 3 of those times, he'd let it go to voicemail and texted back later. Brief, warm enough texts that said nothing. I baked oatmeal cookies and drove to the condo. My daughter-in-law answered the door in a silk robe and accepted the container without inviting me in. "He's on a call," she said. "I'll let him know you came by." She was closing the door before I finished, saying goodbye. I sat in the parking garage of their building and cried the way I hadn't since Edmund's funeral. Then I drove home and made tea and sat in Edmund's study chair, the one he'd had since before we were married, the one that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and old books. And I remembered something he'd said the week before he died. He'd been weak but clear, holding my hand with more strength than I expected. "Kathleen. At the Chemung Valley Bank, downtown branch, there's a safe deposit box in both our names. Box 147. The key is in the tin box in my desk, under the letters. Wait until you're alone to open it. I'd told him to stop talking like that. I wasn't ready. But sitting in his chair, I heard those words differently. I went to the desk. Under a stack of letters in a flat tin box I'd assumed held stamps, there was a small key, brass, a paper tag in Edmund's handwriting, 147. 3 days later, I drove downtown. Inside box 147 was a manila envelope and a handwritten letter. I took both to my car before I opened them. The envelope held a property deed. Heronwood, it said at the top. 43 acres, Schuyler County, New York, including a main structure with 8 guest rooms, full commercial kitchen and dining room, 3 detached cottages, a working apple orchard, 900 feet of private lakefront on Seneca Lake. Edmund had inherited it from his aunt Wilhelmina, who died 3 years before Edmund himself did. He'd mentioned going to her funeral, mentioned she'd been fond of him. He'd never said a word about inheriting anything. The appraisal attached put the current value at $2.85 million. A one-page summary from a property management company showed that a man named Gil Hartman had been managing the property since Wilhelmina's passing. Rental income from the inn, the cottages, and an orchard lease. Approximately $68,000 annually. I read everything twice, then I opened Edmund's letter. He wrote, "Kathleen, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I'm not there. Aunt Willie made me promise something when she left me Heronwood. Don't sell it, don't let it be broken up, keep it for someone who will love it. I kept it quiet because I've watched money change people. I've seen families turn on each other over far less. I wanted you to be loved for yourself, not managed for what you might be worth. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. Trust your instincts about people. You've always known more than you let on. I'm sorry I didn't show you Heronwood while I still could. I was in that parking lot for a long time. I called Louise that night. She came over within the hour and helped me understand what I was holding. Do you realize? She said, spreading the documents on my kitchen table. What would have happened if Cordelia had known about this before the wedding? I thought about the careful questions at dinner, the probing about estate planning, whether there had been any surprises. They'd been looking for exactly this. What do I do? I asked. Louise was quiet for a moment. Nothing yet. You watch, you wait, and you protect yourself first. The next morning, I called Gil Hartman. He answered on the second ring, warm and immediately comfortable, like someone who'd been expecting the call for some time. He'd been managing Heronwood for 3 years. Edmund had visited twice a year. He talked about you constantly, Gil said. Said you'd know what to do with it when the time came. I called an attorney that afternoon. Phoebe Howe had done estate work for Louise and came highly recommended. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and by the end of our first meeting had laid out what she called a textbook progression. First, emotional isolation, making me feel like a burden, a peripheral figure in my son's life. Already done. Second, undermining my confidence, suggesting I couldn't manage my own affairs, that things were getting too complicated at my age. That had begun in small ways, things Michael had started that didn't quite sound like him. Third, creating urgency around a solution they controlled. Fourth, moving in. I've seen this pattern more times than I care to count, Phoebe said. They'll make contact soon. When they do, we'll be ready. She helped me establish an irrevocable trust for the Heronwood property. She arranged a cognitive evaluation. I scored in the 94th percentile for my age group. We documented everything, every call, every visit, every offhand comment about my living situation. Then we waited. My daughter-in-law called on a Wednesday 6 weeks after the wedding. Her voice had changed, softer, almost warm. The voice of someone who has decided to try a different approach. Mom Kathleen, I've been thinking about you so much. We've been so wrapped up settling in. But I feel terrible that we haven't been more present. I said I understood. She mentioned a financial planner named Randall, someone she and Michael had been working with, who had some thoughts that might be really helpful. Just a conversation. No pressure. She suggested coming to my house so I'd be comfortable. She agreed to my home immediately. If the goal had genuinely been to help me, she'd have wanted neutral ground. Coming here meant she wanted to assess what I had. I called Louise. Then I called Phoebe. Phoebe called a contact at the State Attorney General's office, an investigator named Dina Ruiz, who handled financial exploitation cases. "Let them come," Phoebe said. "Let them show us everything." The night before, Louise sat with me at the kitchen table, with the lights low, just talking the way we have for 31 years. She'd been at Edmund's bedside twice during his final week. She knew everything, and she didn't dress it up. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "you're not the same woman who sat in row 6. She was right, I wasn't. They arrived Thursday at 2. Michael, my daughter-in-law, and Randall Stokes. I'd watched from my living room window as Randall stepped out of her car adjusting his cuffs, looking at my house the way men in his line of work look at most things, estimating approximate value. I made coffee. I set out nothing else. They arranged themselves on the couch and the chair by the window like they'd discussed their positions in advance. Randall opened with practiced concern. Widows, alone, managing finances that had once been shared, the stress and exposure of it. Michael sat very straight and didn't quite look at me. I asked protected from what exactly. My daughter-in-law listed possibilities: a medical emergency, a bad financial decision made under stress. The maintenance burden of a house this size. Had I thought about the roof? The water heater? "We've been looking at some wonderful communities," she said, sliding a brochure across the coffee table. "Assisted living, private rooms, recreational programming, dining services." She said at my age twice. Randall pulled documents from his briefcase. A durable power of attorney giving Michael and my daughter-in-law joint authority over my accounts. An asset management agreement with his firm. An application. My name and address already filled in, for the facility in the brochure. He set a pen on the table beside them. I picked up the power of attorney and read it slowly. It was extraordinarily broad. It would have transferred effective control of my accounts and property with very limited ability for me to revoke it. I set it down and said I'd need to think about it. My daughter-in-law's warmth dropped several degrees. They'd put considerable time into this plan, she said. Randall had done significant work. I asked Randall what his management fee was. He told me. I did the math aloud. He confirmed the number. I watched something shift in his expression when I did it without hesitating or asking him to repeat anything. I said I needed to use the restroom. In the hallway, just out of their line of sight, I stood still and listened. "She's smarter than I expected," Randall said low. "She's always been stubborn. My daughter-in-law. We push through. Once she signs, we're done with the back and forth." "And if she won't?" Michael asked. He sounded uncertain. Something in his voice made me hold very still. "Then we document the resistance, the confusion, request a guardianship evaluation. I know someone who can assess and recommend." A pause. "She's 63 with no family nearby. It's not complicated." Silence. Then Michael said quietly, "She raised me alone for 11 years. And now we're helping her," my daughter-in-law said. "Let's stay focused." I walked back into the living room and sat in Edmund's chair, the one I'd brought from the study, the one that still held the faint smell of him. I said, "Before we go any further, I want to tell you something." They waited. I've spent the past 6 weeks with my attorney establishing an irrevocable trust for certain assets, completing a full cognitive evaluation, the results of which I'm happy to share any time, and documenting every interaction we've had since the wedding. I have a recording of this conversation, which I'm legally permitted to make in this state. And I have 2 people in my kitchen who would like to come in. Phoebe came in first, then Investigator Ruiz, who introduced herself briefly and completely. The room went very still. What happened in the next hour I could describe in fine detail, but some of it I don't need to hold on to anymore. Randall attempted to leave twice. Investigator Ruiz spoke to him separately. My daughter-in-law's composure held longer than I expected, and when it finally broke, what came out was not remorse but rage. The specific rage of someone who believes they've been cheated out of something that was never theirs. She looked at me and said, "Do you have any idea how long I have been patient?" Michael stood up from the couch. "Patient for what?" She didn't answer him right away. "You knew about her before we met," Michael said. His voice had gone flat. "You researched my family. You knew about my mother before you knew about me." "I did my research," she said. "That's not a crime." "You married me to get to my mother." She said nothing. He walked out of the room. I heard him in the hallway, very quiet. The legal consequences that followed were appropriate and not negotiable. Randall's firm was separately referred for review. Several other clients were eventually identified. My daughter-in-law faced civil exposure that Phoebe handled with the particular thoroughness of someone who has been waiting a long time to help someone in exactly this situation. Michael stayed that night. He slept in his old room, which still had his track trophies on the shelf, and a faded poster he'd never wanted taken down. I made scrambled eggs in the morning because it was the only thing that felt like something I actually knew how to do. He ate all of them. He said he didn't know who he was right now. I said he was my son. That part didn't change. He asked how I could say that after everything. I told him the truth, that being someone's parent means holding the part of them you know is real even when they can't find it themselves. That didn't mean what he'd done wasn't serious. It didn't mean we weren't going to be in the work of repairing this for a long time, but I wasn't going to pretend he was a stranger. He cried in a way he hadn't since he was a teenager. I let him. In September, I drove to Heronwood for the first time. The GPS took me off the highway onto 2-lane roads through a landscape that turned, mile by mile, into something out of a painting. Rolling hills going amber and rust, sky the particular blue that only exists in upstate New York in early fall. And then Seneca Lake appeared around a curve in the road, long and gray-green and quiet. And I pulled over because I couldn't see properly. Edmund had been here. Twice a year he'd driven this road. Gil Hartman met me at the main house, a white clapboard building with a wraparound porch and a green metal roof and windows that looked out over the water. He was steady-handed and unhurried, the kind of person who'd been quietly taking care of things for decades without needing anyone to notice. He shook my hand and said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Bassett." I stood on that porch for 20 minutes before I could go inside. The house was everything Edmund's letter had promised. Hardwood floors, a kitchen with a commercial 6-burner range, and copper pots hanging from an iron rack, a sitting room with a fireplace facing the lake. In the evenings, Gil told me the light on the water turned gold. The apple orchard was producing well. The 3 cottages were fully equipped and ready. I sat on the porch swing while he walked me through the financials. By the time we were finished, I knew what I was going to do. The following spring, Heronwood opened its doors to women who were fighting to keep what was theirs. We didn't have a formal name at first, just an address and a reputation that spread through the networks lawyers and social workers built quietly over years. Louise came with me. She took the smallest cottage nearest the orchard and called it the best decision she'd made in a decade. We partnered with Phoebe's firm, which offered pro bono consultations every other Thursday. We brought in a financial educator who ran workshops on estate planning and what to do when someone you love starts asking questions that don't quite add up. Michael came on weekends. He repaired the fence around the orchard and fixed the gutters on the main house and learned, slowly, how to be present without either of us, pretending nothing had happened. He was in therapy. He was working through the particular shame of having trusted someone who used that trust as a weapon, and through the harder thing underneath it, understanding his own part in it, the choices he'd made when part of him must have known something was wrong. He met a woman named Tamsin through a friend at work. She was a landscape architect, quiet and direct. She asked about me before she asked about anything else. When Michael told her everything, he told her everything. That was part of his work now. She didn't leave. She came to Heronwood during the apple harvest and stayed for dinner and helped Louise with the afterwards forward. I watched her and thought, this one knows exactly where she is. By the end of our first full year, we'd helped 41 women, prevented 3 fraudulent conservatorship filings, connected families with elder law resources across 4 counties. The State Attorney General's office eventually incorporated part of our documentation guide into a public awareness campaign. I was 64 years old, and for the first time I felt like I was standing in exactly the right place. Last week, a woman drove up the Heronwood driveway in a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield and a garbage bag of documents on the back seat. She was 71. Her son and wife had spent 2 years convincing her she couldn't manage her own affairs, and she'd signed a power of attorney 8 months ago that had already cost her most of her savings. She stood at the front door and asked if this was really a place that could help her. I said yes. I said, come in, let me put on some coffee, and start from the beginning. Edmund always told me I was steadier than I knew. He was right about that, as he was right about most things. What neither of us could have known was that it would take everything falling apart to show me what I was actually made of. That the secret he'd kept to protect me would, in the end, become the thing I used to protect others. I'm 64 years old. I have 43 acres on Seneca Lake, an orchard coming into its 2nd season, a best friend in the cottage nearest the water, and a son who is learning what it means to earn trust back one day at a time. Edmund used to say that love is mostly just showing up. I'm still showing up. I intend to for a very long time.